My name is Nathan Barnes, and I haven't spoken about this in years. Not because I forgot, no, I couldn't forget if I tried. It's because every time I let the memory surface, I feel like something is still watching. And if I speak of it too often, I fear it might come back. It was the summer of 1997, and I was 26 years old. That was the last time I set foot in the White Mountains of New Hampshire. Back then, hiking was my escape. The wild offered a kind of silence you can't find anywhere else, like stepping into another world. I craved that isolation, the kind where your thoughts are the only company you have. But looking back, I realized some places are meant to stay silent and undisturbed. That year, my best friend Mark Talbot and I decided to trek a remote trail through the Whites, away from the popular routes crowded with tourists. We planned for a 3-day hike, nothing too extreme, but enough to make us feel like we were out there alone, miles from anyone. We arrived at the trailhead early on a Friday morning. The sun barely kissed the horizon, and the mist clung to the forest like it didn't want to let go. The air was sharp with the scent of damp earth and pine, the kind of fresh that makes you feel small against the vastness of the woods. I remember Mark making some joke about bears as we laced our boots. I laughed, brushing it off, though I kept my hunting knife strapped to my hip. Not that I thought we would need it, but the forest can change on you fast, and I liked the weight of it against me reassuring. The first day was uneventful, a slow hike through dense thickets that occasionally opened to reveal sweeping views of the mountains stretching endlessly. There's a peace in that kind of isolation. But as the day wore on, something started gnawing at me like the forest wasn't as empty as it seemed. I shook it off. It was probably just the quiet messing with my head. By late afternoon, we reached a brook, its gentle babble filling the silence that had settled over us. We set up camp on a small clearing, built a fire, and cooked dinner. The flames flickered weakly against the growing darkness, and the shadows stretched long across the trees. Mark was the first to comment on it. "Notice how quiet it is?" he asked, poking at the fire with a stick. I had. The usual sounds of the forest, the rustle of leaves, distant calls of birds had faded. It was like the woods were holding their breath. I tried to laugh it off. Maybe they know something we don't. Mark grinned, but his eyes kept drifting toward the trees. We turned in early, but I didn't sleep well. Every creak of the branches sounded too close, and more than once, I thought I heard footsteps circling the edge of our camp. When I finally drifted off, I dreamt of nothing but darkness. We broke camp at dawn, but the weather had turned. The sun was little more than a pale disk behind thick clouds, and the air felt heavy. By noon, the trail had twisted into unfamiliar territory, and our map once so clear seemed useless. Mark swore we were still heading north, but the further we hiked, the more the forest felt wrong. The trees stood too close, and the ground felt softer, like it had been disturbed. At one point, I swore I saw movement through the trees. A figure, pale and thin, watching from a distance. When I turned to Mark, it was gone. I didn't mention it. As the afternoon bled into evening, the woods grew darker, shadows crawling under the trees long before sunset. Panic was beginning to set in. We hadn't seen a single trail marker in hours, and the thought of spending another night lost out here twisted my gut. Then Mark spotted it. "There," he said, pointing through the trees. I followed his gaze and saw it a cabin, tucked away in the clearing like it had been waiting for us. It was small, old, with weathered wood and a sloping roof. There was no path leading to it, no signs of life, but it was shelter. Relief flooded me. We practically stumbled toward it, eager for the promise of walls between us and the darkening woods. The door creaked as we pushed it open. Inside, the cabin was bare, a stone fireplace in the center, a wooden table, and 2 cots. Dust coated every surface, but the place felt solid. Mark laughed, the sound echoing in the emptiness. "See? Luck's on our side." I nodded, but something about the cabin felt off, like we were intruding. We settled in, using the fireplace to cook. As night fell, I felt it again, that sense of being watched. The windows, though caked with grime, seemed darker than they should have been, like something was pressing against the glass from outside. At one point, Mark stepped outside to check for firewood. When he returned, he looked pale. "Did you hear that?" he asked. I shook my head. Thought I heard someone calling. I laughed, but it felt hollow. Probably just the wind. But there was no wind that night. Morning came slow, and when it did, The cabin felt colder than before. Mark and I packed up quickly, eager to get moving. But when we stepped outside, the cabin wasn't there. I am not exaggerating. The clearing was empty, just trees and underbrush, as if the cabin had never existed. Mark swore, circling the clearing, kicking at the dirt. It was here. We didn't imagine it, but the ground where the cabin had stood was untouched. No footprints, no disturbed soil. I remember feeling like I couldn't breathe. The forest around us felt different, darker, like the trees had crept closer overnight. We left in a hurry, moving fast, barely speaking. By the time we found the main trail, the sun was setting again, and when we stumbled out of the woods near our car, I swore I saw the cabin through the trees one last time. But when I looked back, nothing. I haven't been back to the White Mountains since. Mark doesn't talk about it, and when I bring it up, he just shakes his head. But sometimes, late at night, I swear I hear that creaking door in my dreams. And when I wake, for just a second, I swear I can smell pine and old wood like the cabin's still waiting, somewhere out there in the trees. I never thought I would share this story. I tried to forget, to bury it under the weight of reason and the steady ticking of normal life. But some things refused to stay buried. It was July of 2018 when I decided to take a solo camping trip to Yosemite National Park. I was burned out. Tax season had left me drained, and I needed a reset. Yosemite had always felt like the right kind of place for that. I wasn't new to camping or hiking. I had done my fair share over the years, and solitude in nature was something I craved from time to time. I arrived in the late afternoon. The sun hung low, casting long shadows through the towering pines as I pulled into the park. The ranger at the entrance was friendly enough, but gave me a look when I mentioned where I would be camping. "That's a pretty isolated spot," he said, scanning the map. "Not many people head that far in, alone." "That's kind of the point," I replied with a chuckle, trying to brush off the slight unease his comment stirred in me. He handed over the map, but hesitated before letting it go. "Just make sure you check in when you leave. Cell service is spotty out there. And keep your food locked up." His eyes held mine for a moment longer than necessary. I nodded, folding the map and tucking it into my jacket. The drive to the trailhead was quiet, the kind of quiet that presses in around you and settles on your shoulders. I liked it at first. I parked, unloaded my gear, and set out along the trail. The spot I picked was deep in the woods, away from the main campsites, where families with kids and noisy groups tended to gather. It took me the better part of an hour to reach the clearing. The site was perfect, surrounded by tall trees that whispered when the wind brushed through them. I pitched my tent near a fallen log and built a fire pit nearby. By the time I was done, the sky had shifted to shades of deep blue and purple, stars beginning to blink into existence. The first night was uneventful. I sat by the fire, cooking a simple meal, and listened to the forest settle into night. The usual sounds filled the air: crickets, the distant hoot of an owl, the rustling of small creatures in the underbrush. I felt at peace. But that peace didn't last. The next night was different. I had spent the day hiking and returned to camp exhausted. After dinner, I crawled into my tent, zipped the flap, and lay there listening to the faint crackling of the fire outside. My eyes were heavy, and I drifted off quickly. I don't know what woke me. Maybe it was the snap of a branch or the shift in the air. But suddenly, I was wide awake, staring at the fabric of my tent illuminated faintly by the dying fire outside. That's when I heard it. Footsteps. Heavy. Deliberate. Coming from just beyond the edge of the firelight. I froze, every muscle tense, straining to listen. The steps stopped directly outside my tent. I could see the faintest shadow, tall and unmoving. "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. Nothing. I sat up slowly, heart hammering against my ribs. "Hey, if someone's out there, this isn't funny." Silence. Silence. I unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside, the flashlight trembling in my hand. I swept the beam across the clearing. Empty. The fire was little more than embers, casting weak shadows that danced and flickered. I stepped out, scanning the tree line. There was no one. No sound. I stood there for a long time, the cold night air seeping into my skin. But the forest remained still. Eventually, I convinced myself I had imagined it and went back to bed. but I didn't sleep. The following day felt wrong. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I kept looking over my shoulder during the hike, expecting to see someone following me. The trees seemed darker, the paths unfamiliar, even though I'd walked them the day before. That night, I double-checked the perimeter of my campsite, made sure everything was locked up, and sat closer to the fire. It burned brighter and longer than the previous night. I watched the flames, trying to let them lull me into a sense of security. But just as I was starting to feel calm, I saw it. A figure standing just beyond the light. I froze, gripping the handle of the small camping knife in my pocket. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. I could barely make out its shape, tall, thin, and still. I shone the flashlight directly at it. Nothing. The beam cut through the trees, but the figure was gone. I told myself it was a trick of the light, but the pit in my stomach knew better. By the third night, I was ready to leave. I packed most of my gear, intending to hike back to the car first thing in the morning. I didn't care about cutting the trip short, but that night, that was the worst of all. I awoke to the sound of breathing. Not mine. It was coming from just outside the thin layer of fabric separating me from the outside world. Deep, ragged breaths. Slow and purposeful. I held my breath, eyes wide in the darkness. The breathing grew louder, closer, until it felt like whoever, or whatever, it was stood just inches away. I couldn't move. The tent fabric shifted slightly, as if something had brushed against it. I gripped the knife, ready to slash at anything that tried to get inside. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the breathing stopped. I lay there, trembling, until the first light of dawn crept through the trees. When I finally crawled out of the tent, the campsite was undisturbed. Nothing seemed out of place. But there, in the dirt just outside the entrance to my tent, were footprints. Large, human. They led to the edge of the clearing and stopped. I left that morning, not bothering to check in at the ranger station. I didn't want to explain what I couldn't understand. But to this day, I wonder who, or what, stood outside my tent, and why they never stepped into the light. It was the kind of heat that clung to you like a second skin, even as the sun dipped below the jagged peaks of the Chisos Mountains. Big Bend National Park in July isn't for the faint of heart. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of mesquite and desert blooms, and the cicadas cried out like restless spirits. My name is Daniel Hart, and I've been a ranger here for the better part of 2 decades. I've seen my fair share of strange things in the vast, desolate stretches of this park. Everything from lost hikers to unexplained lights in the sky. But nothing comes close to the events of that night. It started innocently enough. July 15th, 2018. The park was quieter than usual, most visitors deterred by the relentless summer heat. I was on the late shift, patrolling the Rio Grande Village area when I spotted their RV, a sleek white vehicle parked neatly at one of the designated camping spots. The fire pit nearby was lit, flames dancing lazily against the twilight. From a distance, I saw the couple sitting close together, silhouetted by the firelight. They looked peaceful, laughing softly as they shared a meal. I didn't think much of it. Campers were common, and this pair didn't seem any different, just another couple escaping the chaos of city life for the serenity of the desert. The next morning, I returned to the spot during my rounds. The fire was still burning, reduced to embers, but still alive. That struck me as odd. It's park protocol to fully extinguish campfires before turning in, and most visitors are pretty diligent about it. The RV was there, parked in the same spot. But something about it felt wrong. The air around it was still, unnaturally so, as if the desert itself was holding its breath. I called out, my voice breaking the silence. "Hello? Park ranger here. Just checking in." No answer. I stepped closer, the gravel crunching beneath my boots. The windows of the RV were tinted, giving me no clue as to what was inside. The door was locked, which wasn't unusual. But when I tried the handle, I noticed something strange. The lock was engaged from the inside. That's when I noticed the chairs around the fire pit. 2 of them, perfectly placed, with blankets draped over the backs. Plates of half-eaten food sat on the small camping table, as if the couple had simply stepped away for a moment. But the food was untouched, now buzzing with flies. The air felt heavier, colder, despite the sun climbing higher in the sky. I radioed back to the main station, reporting the situation. By noon, a search team had assembled. We started combing the area, calling out their names, Rachel and Mark Lanning, according to the park registry. Their RV was towed back to the station for further inspection. Inside, everything was in perfect order. Their clothes were neatly folded in the drawers. A pair of hiking boots sat by the door. The only thing missing was them. The strangest part? Their personal items, wallets, phones, keys were all still inside. There was no sign of a struggle, no blood, no broken glass. It was as if they had simply vanished into thin air. The search extended for miles around the campsite, but the desert gave us nothing. No footprints, no discarded belongings. Just the endless expanse of rock and sand, indifferent to our desperation. 3 days into the search, one of the rangers found something. Deep in a ravine, miles from the campsite, he came across a circle of scorched earth. In the center was a pile of ash, surrounded by strange symbols carved into the ground. They looked ancient, almost ritualistic. None of us could make sense of it. That night, back at the station, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying everything in my mind, their laughter by the fire, the untouched food, the eerie stillness of the RV. Around midnight, I decided to review the footage from the trail cameras we'd set up near the campsite. At first, there was nothing unusual. The couple arrived at the campsite around 6 p.m., laughing and unloading their gear. They set up their chairs, lit the fire, and sat down to eat. But then, around 10:30 p.m., the footage became strange. The screen flickered, static distorting the image. For a split second, I thought I saw something. Something tall and shadowy moving just beyond the firelight. It was there, and then it wasn't. The next few frames showed the couple looking around nervously, as if they'd heard something. Then, the screen went black. When the footage resumed, the fire was burning alone. The chairs were empty. Word spread quickly among the rangers, though we were careful not to alarm the public. But fear has a way of creeping in, silent and insidious. Every night, I found myself drawn back to the campsite, unable to shake the feeling that something was watching us. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I heard it. A low, guttural sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. It wasn't an animal I've lived in this park long enough to recognize every howl, growl, and screech the desert has to offer. This was something else. I turned on my flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness. The light landed on something in the distance, two faint shapes standing side by side. My heart stopped. Rachel? Mark? No response. I took a step closer, my hand instinctively reaching for the radio on my belt. And then, they were gone. The official investigation lasted 2 weeks before it was quietly closed. The report listed their disappearance as unknown causes, a vague term that offered no comfort. But I couldn't let it go. I started digging, poring over old records and local legends. That's when I came across the story tales of an ancient curse tied to the land. They spoke of a shadowy figure that roamed the desert, luring unsuspecting travelers into the night. Those who followed never returned. I don't know what I saw that night, and I'm not sure I want to. But every now and then, as I patrol the park, I hear that low, guttural sound echoing through the canyons. And I wonder if Rachel and Mark are still out there, trapped in the endless expanse of Big Bend, forever lost to the desert's embrace. If you ever visit, be careful. And whatever you do, don't follow the shadows. When I first decided to visit the Grand Canyon, it wasn't for adventure or thrills. I had been going through a rough patch, the kind that chips away at your sense of self and leaves you wondering what's left. My name is Caleb Watson, and back then, I was just another guy trying to find some peace. My best friend Drew and I planned the trip on a whim, deciding that a few days of camping away from the noise of life might help us reset. We arrived at the South Rim in the late afternoon. The sky was painted with streaks of amber and violet as the sun sank low on the horizon. The sheer scale of the canyon silenced every thought in my head. The endless expanse of jagged cliffs and winding ridges seemed almost alive, a breathing relic of time that dwarfed our presence. We pitched our tent at one of the more remote sites, a spot Drew had picked for its supposed serenity. No crowds, he'd said. Just us and nature. It was quiet, all right. Too quiet. The first night passed uneventfully. The air carried the faint scent of juniper and earth, and the occasional rustle of a squirrel or the hoot of an owl punctuated the stillness. Drew and I shared a few beers by the fire, talking about everything and nothing, until exhaustion claimed us. The second night was when things began to feel off. It started with the whispers. At first, I thought it was Drew playing a prank. We'd been sitting around the fire again, the flames casting long shadows that danced against the jagged rocks surrounding our site. I'd stepped away to grab something from the tent when I heard it faint and almost melodic, like a breeze weaving through the canyon. Caleb. The sound stopped me in my tracks. I spun around, half expecting Drew to be standing there with a smirk on his face. But he was still by the fire, poking at the embers with a stick. "You say something?" I called out. Drew looked up, confused. "No." "Why?" I forced a laugh, brushing it off as my imagination. "Nothing. Thought I heard something, that's all." He shrugged and went back to tending the fire. But the unease in my chest lingered. Later that night, I woke to the sound of footsteps outside the tent. They were slow, deliberate, crunching on the dry soil just beyond the thin fabric barrier. My heart leapt into my throat. "Drew," I whispered. He groaned beside me, clearly still half asleep. "What? Did you hear that?" "Hear what?" Before I could respond, the footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, pressing in on me like a weight. I grabbed the flashlight from my pack and unzipped the tent as quietly as I could. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing but rocks and scattered brush. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. No response. I lingered there for a moment, scanning the shadows, before retreating back into the tent. Drew was already snoring again, oblivious. I told myself it was probably just an animal, and tried to go back to sleep. But every rustle of the wind outside set my nerves on edge. The next morning, I told Drew what had happened. "Probably a coyote or something," he said between bites of a granola bar. "They are all over the place out here." "Coyotes don't whisper," I muttered. He laughed, but it didn't feel genuine. I could tell he was trying to brush it off, just as I had the night before. We spent the day hiking along one of the less traveled trails, hoping the exercise and sunlight would shake the unease. The views were stunning, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every so often, I'd catch Drew glancing over his shoulder too, his face tight with unease. Neither of us said anything about it, but the tension between us grew heavier as the day wore on. That night, the whispers came back. They started just as we were settling into our sleeping bags, faint and indistinct at first, like the murmurs of a distant conversation carried on the wind. "Do you hear that?" I asked Drew. He nodded, his face pale in the dim light of the lantern. We sat in silence, straining to make out the words. The voices seemed to come from all around us, bouncing off the canyon walls in an eerie echo. "Caleb." The sound of my name made my blood run cold. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. Drew's eyes were wide with fear. It said my name too. We bolted out of the tent, flashlights in hand, and scanned the area. The fire had burned down to embers, casting weak, flickering light over the campsite. Beyond its glow, the darkness was impenetrable. "Who's out there?" Drew shouted, his voice cracking. No response. We stayed up the rest of the night, backs pressed against the rocks with our flashlights trained on the shadows. The whispers faded as the hours dragged on, but neither of us dared to close our eyes. By morning, we were both on edge. Drew suggested packing up and heading back to the main campground, but I wasn't ready to leave just yet. Something about the whispers felt personal, like they were meant for us. I wanted answers, though I wasn't sure I would like what I found. We decided to stay one more night. The final night was worse than I could have imagined. The whispers started earlier this time, as we sat by the fire. They were louder now, clearer. "Leave." The single word cut through the air like a blade. Drew and I froze, staring at each other with wide eyes. "Did you hear that?" I asked. He nodded, his face pale. We didn't wait to see what would happen next. Scrambling to pack up our gear, we were both shaking with adrenaline. But the whispers didn't stop. Caleb. Drew. The voices were everywhere, overlapping in a chaotic symphony of fear. They grew louder and louder until it felt like they were screaming inside my head. Go. The command was deafening. We grabbed what we could and ran, leaving the tent and most of our supplies behind. The trail back to the main campground felt endless, the darkness around us alive with movement and sound. I swear I could feel something following us. Its presence heavy and oppressive. Drew kept looking over his shoulder, his face a mask of terror. When we finally reached the safety of the main campground, the whispers stopped. We reported what had happened to a park ranger the next morning. He listened patiently, his expression unreadable. "You're not the first to experience something like that," he said quietly. "The canyon has a way of playing tricks on people." I wanted to press him for more information, but the look in his eyes stopped me. Whatever he knew, it wasn't something he was willing to share. I haven't been back to the Grand Canyon since that trip. Sometimes I wonder if it was all in our heads, a shared hallucination brought on by stress and isolation. But deep down, I know the truth. The whispers were real. And they weren't just voices. They were something else. Something ancient. Something that didn't want us there.